There are moments in cinema that stop time, moments where the screen seems to hold its breath, where the audience collectively leans forward, and where an actor does something so unexpected, so raw, and so utterly unforgettable that it rewrites everything you thought you knew about them. Jamie Lee Curtis created one of those moments in True Lies, and decades later, people are still talking about it. Not just because of what she did on screen, but because of everything that happened before the cameras rolled, during the shoot itself, and long after the credits faded to black. This is the story behind one of Hollywood's most daring performances. A story packed with courage, vulnerability, near disasters, and the kind of behind-the-scenes chaos that makes the final product even more remarkable. To understand why that scene hit audiences so hard, you have to understand who Jamie Lee Curtis was at the time. By 1994, she had already carved out a serious reputation in Hollywood. She had screamed her way through Halloween, earned dramatic credibility in films like A Fish Called Wanda, and proven she could hold her own against the biggest names in the business. But nobody, and that includes Curtis herself, had ever seen her do anything quite like what she pulled off in True Lies. The film, directed by the relentless perfectionist James Cameron, was a massive, sprawling action comedy about a secret agent named Harry Tasker, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, whose wife Helen, played by Curtis, has absolutely no idea her husband leads a double life. The premise was ripe for comedy and drama, but the scene that truly defined the film wasn't an explosion or a car chase. It was a dance. Cameron knew from the very beginning that the dance sequence would either make or break the movie's emotional core. Harry Tasker, using his spy resources in a morally questionable but undeniably entertaining way, orchestrates a situation where his wife, believing she is performing a seductive dance for a mysterious stranger, is actually dancing for her own husband. The concept was designed to be simultaneously funny, tense, romantic, and charged with a kind of awkward intimacy that most films would never dare to touch. Cameron needed an actress who could carry all of those contradictory emotions at once, who could be vulnerable without being weak, seductive without being uncomfortable to watch, and funny without undercutting the genuine emotional stakes of the scene. He needed someone who could strip away every layer of their public image and just be completely, nakedly human in front of the camera. He needed Jamie Lee Curtis. What the audience saw in the finished film was a woman shedding her clothes and her inhibitions in a dimly lit hotel room, moving with a nervous, awkward energy that somehow managed to be endearing and magnetic at the same time. What they didn't see was the months of psychological preparation that Curtis put into getting herself ready for that moment. By her own account, the scene terrified her, not because of the physical exposure, though that was certainly a significant part of it, but because of the emotional exposure it required. Curtis has spoken at length in various interviews over the years about the vulnerability she felt approaching this role, describing how she had to essentially dismantle the protective walls she had built around herself as a public figure and as a woman in an industry that had spent years scrutinizing and judging her body. To stand in front of a camera, in front of a crew, in front of Schwarzenegger, and perform that dance required a level of personal courage that went far beyond anything physically dangerous. And then, right in the middle of all that carefully constructed vulnerability, she fell. During the filming of the dance sequence, Curtis slipped, her heel caught awkwardly, and she tumbled to the floor. For a split second, everything could have unraveled. The scene could have collapsed into embarrassment. The mood could have shattered, and they might have had to start over from scratch, forcing Curtis to rebuild all of that emotional momentum from the ground up. But here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Rather than calling cut, rather than rushing to check if she was okay and resetting the scene, Cameron kept the cameras rolling, and Curtis, to her enormous credit, stayed in character. She kept going. She turned what could have been a disaster into something that actually made the scene better, more real, more human, more honest. The stumble became part of the performance, and Schwarzenegger's genuine, unscripted look of surprise in that moment gave the whole sequence an authenticity that no amount of careful planning could have manufactured. Later accounts would vary slightly on the details, whether the fall was entirely accidental or whether elements of it had been discussed in advance. But what everyone agrees on is that the decision to keep it in the final cut was absolutely the right one. Cameron's instinct in that moment was the instinct of a filmmaker who understood that reality, when it breaks through into a scripted scene, is almost always more powerful than anything written on a page. The fall was real. Curtis's recovery was real, and the audience could feel that reality even if they couldn't quite articulate why. It was one of those rare accidents that a director spends an entire career hoping for, a moment of genuine human truth captured on film and preserved forever. But the dance sequence was only one chapter in what turned out to be a remarkably demanding physical and emotional journey for Curtis throughout the production. True Lies was not a film that pampered its cast. James Cameron had a well-documented reputation for pushing his productions to extremes, for demanding absolute commitment from everyone on set, and for refusing to cut corners, even when cutting corners would have been the safer, easier, and far less expensive option. The scale of True Lies was extraordinary. Real military aircraft, real helicopters, enormous set pieces built from scratch, and stunt work that would make modern insurance adjusters faint. And in the middle of all of it was Jamie Lee Curtis, turning in a performance that matched the film's ambition beat for beat. One of the most striking examples of that commitment came with the helicopter sequence. There's a scene in True Lies where Helen Tasker finds herself dangling from a helicopter high above open water, the wind howling around her, the ground terrifyingly far below. It is exactly the kind of scene that studios employ professional stunt performers for, people who have trained specifically for this type of work, who know how to manage the physical dangers, and whose job it is to protect expensive and irreplaceable lead actors from unnecessary risk. Cameron naturally suggested using a double for the sequence. Curtis refused. She had watched how Cameron operated, had seen how he threw himself into the physical reality of his productions, rather than directing from a comfortable distance, and she decided that if he was willing to hang from helicopter door to capture her close-up, she was going to be the person actually in that close-up. It was a statement of professional solidarity as much as it was a demonstration of personal fearlessness, and it was completely in character for the version of Jamie Lee Curtis that showed up to make this film. The preparation for that stunt was extensive. Curtis trained for weeks, working on both her physical conditioning and her mental composure, learning how to manage fear and maintain her performance even when everything around her was loud and dangerous and designed by nature to trigger every instinct toward panic. When the day came and the helicopter lifted off, carrying her up into the sky at speeds approaching 70 miles per hour, she remained calm. The footage that Cameron captured showed a woman completely in control, completely present, and completely committed to telling the story. The fact that it happened to be her actual birthday on the day they filmed the sequence added one more layer to an already remarkable story. Curtis had decided to mark her 36th year on Earth by doing something that most people would consider legitimately terrifying, and she did it with such evident skill and composure that audiences watching the finished film had no idea how much courage it had required. The relationship between Curtis and Cameron throughout the production was a fascinating one. Cameron is not widely known as a director who is easy or gentle or particularly warm with his collaborators. His productions are legendary for their intensity, their length, their demands, and their director's absolute refusal to accept anything less than total commitment. And yet, by all accounts, he and Curtis developed a genuine creative partnership on True Lies, a mutual respect between two professionals who recognized in each other a shared unwillingness to take the easy road. Cameron trusted Curtis with material that required an actress of genuine depth and range, and Curtis rewarded that trust with a performance that expanded what everyone thought she was capable of. The dance scene alone would have been enough to cement True Lies as a turning point in her career. The helicopter stunt, the emotional complexity she brought to Helen's arc as a woman discovering her own strength and independence, and the sharp comedic timing she demonstrated throughout. All of it together created something genuinely special. The comedic dimension of Curtis's performance in True Lies is actually one of its most underappreciated qualities. Helen Tasker is not simply a damsel caught up in her husband's extraordinary world. She is a fully realized character with her own desires, frustrations, and sense of humor. There is a scene in which Helen, completely convinced she is operating as a real spy for the first time, manages to accidentally set off a chain of events involving a runaway limousine that escalates into pure, glorious slapstick chaos. Curtis plays it with the perfectly calibrated mix of terror and exhilaration, communicating without a single word of dialogue that Helen is simultaneously frightened out of her mind and more alive than she has felt in years. It is brilliant physical comedy, and it demonstrates a side of Curtis's talent that the horror genre she was most associated with had never really given her the opportunity to explore. Cameron, for his part, had taken an unusual amount of personal ownership over the film's comedic elements. After reviewing the script and finding most of the existing jokes unsatisfying, he undertook a substantial rewrite of all the comedic material himself. A remarkable decision for a director whose reputation rested primarily on the kind of muscular, serious-minded science fiction and action filmmaking that produced Aliens and Terminator 2. The fact that Cameron had a legitimate sense of humor, and that he understood comedy well enough to rewrite an entire film's worth of jokes from scratch, came as a genuine surprise to many people in the industry. But the results spoke for themselves. The comedy in True Lies works not because it is particularly sophisticated or clever in the abstract, but because Cameron understood how to root every joke in character and situation, how to make the humor emerge from the specific relationships and dynamics that the film had established. Curtis was a crucial part of making that approach work, because she understood instinctively how to play comedy without telegraphing it, how to be funny by being real rather than by performing funniness. What is also worth understanding about the making of True Lies is the sheer logistical ambition of the production, because that ambition created the environment in which both the remarkable performances and the various near disasters occurred. Cameron did not simply rent props or build sets that suggested military hardware. He secured actual United States Marine Corps Harrier jets for the film's climactic sequence, paying the kind of money that most productions spend on their entire practical effects budget just for an hour of flight time per aircraft. The total bill for the Harrier jets alone reached figures that would be extraordinary by any standard, and this was simply one line item in a production that consistently prioritized authenticity and spectacle over economy and safety. The runway sequence that put Schwarzenegger in genuine danger, when a miscommunication between the stunt team and the aircraft pilots nearly resulted in the star of the film being dragged into a jet engine at over 100 miles per hour, was a direct consequence of the complexity and scale that Cameron demanded of his productions. Real planes create real risks, and on True Lies, those risks were not always as manageable as the production might have hoped. There were also shadows that fell over the production, darker stories that would not fully emerge until years after the film had become an established classic. Eliza Dushku, who played Curtis and Schwarzenegger's daughter in the film and who was only 12 years old during production, later came forward with serious allegations about her treatment on set. She described inappropriate behavior from a stunt coordinator, as well as a physical injury she sustained during a stunt that went wrong, an injury she attributed to negligence by the crew. Her account was deeply troubling and cast a retrospective shadow over a production that had, in so many other respects, been celebrated as a triumph. The allegations served as a reminder that even the most celebrated and successful Hollywood productions can harbor failures of care and responsibility, particularly toward the most vulnerable people on set. These revelations did not erase the genuine achievements of True Lies, but they complicated them in ways that any honest accounting of the film's legacy has to acknowledge. The movie industry of the early 1990s operated under a set of standards regarding the protection of child performers that would be considered wholly inadequate today, and the experiences Dushku described were, by her account, not taken seriously enough at the time they occurred. The conversations her revelations sparked about the responsibilities of studios and production companies toward young performers were important ones, and they are part of the complete story of what True Lies actually was as a production, behind all the spectacle and achievement. And yet the film endures. It endures because of the genuine magic that was captured on screen despite everything, because of the performances that Cameron coaxed from his cast, and because of moments like the one that has kept people talking for 30 years, a woman in a hotel room, moving awkwardly and bravely and beautifully, showing a side of herself that nobody had seen before, and then falling, and getting back up, and continuing to dance. Jamie Lee Curtis left nothing to the imagination in that scene.